Thank you. I have actually a prepared introduction here that I got for our speaker, but as is usually my habit, I'm not going to pay any attention to that. I want to first talk to you about something I heard recently, and you may have heard it too, although I don't know how much publicity it got. There is a phrase that has gotten some common currency: "Make America great again." Anybody heard that? Any one of you? It's when you hear something like that, it's worth considering what made America great in the first place. And what made America great and an exceptional country in the first place was not saber rattling. It wasn't warmongering. It wasn't even strutting around a golf course. It was our foundation documents, and most importantly, our Constitution. Those values and ideals expressed in that document are really what has created the country that we know and love and need to work to preserve. For the past 15 years, those of us who admire this document have learned more and more about it from one source. Happily, that source has come to visit us probably 12 or 15 times. I make no endorsements either, by the way. Towards the end of this month, on January the 30th, there will be on this very location a town hall that all of you are invited to, where you can evaluate all of the candidates for county attorney. They will be on their best behavior. That activity is actually, that event is sponsored by the ACLU of Arizona and HSGP. It's a co-sponsorship, and it'll happen here. I was at an ACLU board meeting yesterday. They are excited about it, so they're really pleased to be here in this venue to sponsor that event. The candidates all sound great, they really do. But I do want to remind you of one thing. I don't think I've ever seen any of the other five candidates, the other additional five candidates here. There's only one candidate that I've seen here, and I've seen him here at least a dozen times. Not only that, every time I have called on that candidate to make presentations in behalf of the ACLU, in behalf of Secular Coalition for Arizona, in any case, he has yet to say no. So let me present our speaker today, Bob McWhirter.
All right, very good. First of all, the sign, just a disclosure, that was my fault with the sign before, okay? When you become a candidate, you have to get just slightly shameless, so nobody should get in trouble for putting that up. My topic today, of course, is the 19th Amendment, and this title is Making America into Herself, okay? And this is part of a theme. I have a fair amount of history of the 19th Amendment, but what I want to do more is talk about the 19th Amendment in the context of our Constitution and what it means and what its growth means. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. The United States of America began with these words. That's when we began. Sure, there was all kinds of stuff going on before, etc., but we began with the words, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. The Declaration of Independence founded us on equality rather than ethnicity. It founded us on liberty rather than race. America is an idea, and it's an ideal. The United States is pretty much the only country founded on a creed, a belief system, not a common heritage, ethnicity, or ruling political or religious elite. You become American because you adhere to that ideal. That's what makes you American. It doesn't matter what your race is. It doesn't matter what your religious belief is or non-religious belief. If you believe in that ideal and you live to that ideal, you are an American. That is unique among countries. Our national identity is not defined in religious or ethnic terms. Our national identity is defined in the belief in that creed. Nor does gender define it. There are some countries where citizenship is defined by gender, not in the United States. But we didn't always get there. Now, we hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal. The 19th Amendment says, the right of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of sex. Congress shall have power to enforce this article by appropriate legislation. You can't take an entire half of the human race and exclude them from the ideal of America. The 19th Amendment is the natural progression from America's foundation. Now, all men are created equal. It included women too. Okay. I always like to make sure that I am the geekiest constitutional person in the room. To prove that, I went back to a grammar from 1745. Okay? And what that grammar says is, prescribe the generic he as a gender-neutral singular pronoun, even back then. So when they wrote, all men are created equal, it included women too. Now, they didn't exactly live up to it, but the aspirational doc, when you say all men are created equal, it is the gender-neutral pronoun, even in 1776. Okay, so let's start from that. Thus, all men meant all women too. This is a charming letter from Abigail Adams in 1776 to John. I desire you would remember the ladies and be more generous and favorable to them than your ancestors. If particular care and attention is not paid to the ladies, we are determined to ferment a rebellion and will not hold ourselves bound by any laws in which we have not voice or representation. John Adams, who very often wisely listened to Abigail, unfortunately did not listen to Abigail on this one. And of course, you've got John Adams, which was kind of a good portrayal of, especially his relationship with Abigail as well. Okay, this is the start of the Me Too movement. In 1789, all men created equal manifests itself in a constitution of we the people. We the people, not we the states, not we the white male Protestants, okay, and not we the citizens. This is crucial. We the people. This is a universal concept of rights. If you go back to the foundation, John Locke, the basic idea, rights are inherent in the individual. Citizenship is supposed to confer those rights, but they are inherent to the individual. Citizenship is just a mechanism to get you there. We the people are the first and last words of the Constitution. If you look at the 10th Amendment, it ends, rights are to the government or to the states or to the people. So the bookend of the Constitution, if you include the Bill of Rights, which I think you should, is we the people. The problem, though, of course, was the people in 1789, blacks, Native Americans, women, and poor folk, they weren't recognized as the people. Throughout our history, we have both risen to the ideal that people are created equal, and yet failed to meet its aspirations. This has been the struggle of America. The framers of our Constitution failed. They failed to live up to their own words. Although the Constitution embodies created equal and the people, the framers failed to resolve the conflict between freedom and slavery. We are heirs to that failure. There was slavery by race, and there was slavery by gender. Okay, this is a painting that was made in the 1800s, which depicts violence on both sides. Violence against men and violence against women. America was founded on sexual slavery. As much as the labor of slaves, it was also the sexual slavery involved. The average black person is 1/4 white in the United States, just by genetic analysis. Now you could argue, okay, some of those liaisons or may have been real love and affection, but the point of this is to consent. You've heard of the term statutory rape? That's because minors don't have the statutory or the legal right to consent. They're too young. They don't have the legal power to consent, right? Slaves did not have the legal right to consent. So by definition, these relationships were predicated on rape. Aristocracy or republic? We the people versus sexism and slavery. And by the way, you cannot talk about the history of the 19th Amendment or the Constitution without confronting this issue. There was a debate in early America. People don't realize this. What they were debating in writing the Constitution was whether we should allow America to be a republic or an aristocracy. Today we take for granted that the founding fathers intended this republic, this democratic republic. But really, many intended an aristocracy, mostly in the South. South Carolina was the worst, by far. Aristocracy and slavery are symbiotic. John Adams, all our misfortunes arise from a single source, the reluctance of the southern colonies to republican government. This was the debate going on. We don't realize this because we get this watered down, kind of romanticized view taught to us about the founding fathers. This is what they were arguing about. One side won this debate intellectually, which laid the foundation for something greater. James Madison, in proportion as slavery prevails in a state, the government, however democratic in name, must be aristocratic in fact. The inexorable result of a high density of slaves was the concentration of ruling power in a minority. With slavery, republicanism is fallacious. The states were divided into different interests, not by size, but principally from their having or not having slaves. This was the central thing that almost made this country not happen. Aristocracy was centered not only on racism, but male paternity. Women, children, and slaves were all dependent to the white male elite. The image of the Southern belle versus the reality of poor women in an economically depressed South. The fact of the matter is, Southern women, even high socioeconomically class Southern women, lacked all political rights. Black and white women had different social status in the South. There is no question about that. Okay, just watch Gone with the Wind, okay? But the fact of the matter is, there was no difference in economic power that they really had. And for poor white women, there were no more powerful than black slave women. South was not unique in regarding race and sex discrimination, but it was unique in this kind of powered aristocratic paternalism. But Southern white women had the same political rights and status as slaves. During the women's suffrage movement, which actually ends up in the passing of the 19th Amendment, this is a graph of America just before August 18th, 1920. If you notice, the western states had full suffrage. Presidential and municipal school bond suffrage was in these middle states. If you notice, the deep South states maintained complete lack of suffrage for women. Remember, states were giving women the right to vote before the 19th Amendment passed, all right? The South maintained this tradition, for the most part, of lack of women's votings and rights, and it was concentrated there because it still had that tradition. By the way, the first state to give women the rights to vote? Wyoming. Why is that? They needed the population because you couldn't count the cows and sheep. So they needed enough population of voting rights for people, so Wyoming, which is hardly a blue state these days, right? Wyoming was the first state to give women the right to vote, okay? Yay for Wyoming, okay. Which still has 3 electoral votes. Okay, that's a whole different other talk, but okay. So this gets into the Constitution about the nature of this Constitution. So we've got these great aspirational documents and statements, but the reality on the ground is horrible. We the people versus a covenant with death. William Lloyd Garrison in the 1850s was the great abolitionist. He started the Liberator newspaper, a lot of work going with William Lloyd Garrison, okay? He was the first one to call for the secession of the North from the South. The first calls for the nation to be split up didn't come from the South, and there's a specific reason why. It came from the North. No union with slaveholders. The Constitution is a pro-slavery covenant with death and an agreement with hell, was his position. Now, sexist or slave constitution or not, this was the debate. There are 4 clauses in the Constitution that embody slavery, okay? Importation clause, the fugitive slave clause, the 3/5 clause. It protected the nature of slavery in the Constitution. And yet, there was the seeds in the Constitution for something greater. First, the Constitution did not just create a national republic, it required states to have a republican form of government. You want to be in this union, you have to have a republican form of government. Now that repudiates the arguments that were made principally by the southern states to move toward an aristocracy. So at least in form, they had to look like they were republican and not aristocratic. In function, especially in places like I said, South Carolina, it wasn't the truth, but at least in form they had to be republican, all right? Federalist number 38, James Madison. National and state governments were republican because our political institutions were established on the basis of human rights and framed for their preservation. So this is James Madison, a slaveholder, arguing about the nature of the Constitution, the need for republican government because the purpose is for human rights. Now, of course, he was not willing to implement that on his own plantation, but he wrote something that gave us the chance to advance further. Second, the word slave never appears in the Constitution. Now, the delegates were talking about slaves, black people, other terms that aren't at all flattering. Other persons, such other persons, persons held in service or labor. Those are the terms that the Constitution actually uses. Now, there's a semantic and logical reason why that is. If you're talking about we the people and you refer to people as such other persons, that contradiction cannot last forever. Abraham Lincoln made this very point in the Copper Union speech, February 27, 1860. Neither the word slave nor slavery is found in the Constitution, and whatever in that instrument the slave is alluded to, he is called a person. You see this kind of subversive underlying thing? Abraham Lincoln was one of the ones that picked up this contradiction. And this, by the way, was what put him in prominence and in the running for the presidential election, this Copper Union speech. It gave him national attention. This mode of alluding to slaves and slavery was employed on the purpose to exclude the Constitution from the idea that there could be property in man. Okay, he's making the exact point that this Constitution is based on the concept of we the people. Gouverneur Morris, he was the penman of the Constitution. He was the one that wrote it out. He was one of the few delegates who actually argued that slavery was a moral and economic wrong. All the other delegates didn't really want to talk about it, or if they did, they were fighting for slavery. He was the one who was fighting for it, and he's the one who writes the words, we the people. He wrote the preamble. By the way, he's kind of an interesting guy. He lost a leg because he got into a carriage accident. Okay, he was running down the street and a carriage ran it over. He was running down the street because he was in the bedroom of a married woman and got caught by the husband and was running out and got run over by a carriage, and that's how he lost his leg.
Still happening today.
Still happening today, yeah. Again, those are the things they didn't tell you about in the 5th grade, but that's why he walked around with the wooden leg. Okay. Yeah, there wasn't sex education back then, okay? Here's Morris. Upon what principle is it that the slaves shall be computed in the representation? Are they men? Then make them citizens and let them vote. Okay? Morris wrote the Constitution preamble, we the people. Frankly, I think the anti-slavery forces knew they couldn't get that and have the Union come together, so they wrote it as the foundation of the document. And again, you can't have this contradiction last forever. The structure won't suffer it. Gouverneur Morris, He knew that we, the people, followed the declarations, all men are created equal. A constitution of equally created people cannot perpetually suffer slavery's contradictions. Once you start labeling people the people, such other persons, instead of using a different category of slave. Did I misspell suffer? No. Ah, geez. Okay, fine. Spell checker doesn't catch that. Okay, fine. All right. Nor can you perpetually allow the contradiction of women not having the right to vote. Because remember, women are the people too. It just becomes a logical facade. All right. The seed Morris and other planted eventually allowed Lincoln to connect the Declaration of Independence to the Constitution with the Gettysburg Address. This is why the Gettysburg Address is so fundamental. 7 years ago, our fathers brought forth on this continent a new nation, conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. Well, he's invoking right there the Declaration of Independence. All men are created equal. He goes on. And that government of the people, by the people, and for the people should not perish from the earth. Okay? Connecting it to the Constitution, we the people. The Gettysburg Address is irrefutable. If you start arguing against the Gettysburg Address, it is essentially an argument of racism. Nobody's going to say, oh, the Gettysburg Address, it was flawed or something. If you even say that, you're defining yourself as a racist, essentially. To deny it is the working definition of racism. Universal freedom is a democratic republic's prerequisite. So this is how Abraham Lincoln was the president. There's two presidents that shaped the Constitution more than any others. One of them was Abraham Lincoln, followed by the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, right? But it's this concept, this driving home the point that you cannot have this democracy survive unless you have universal equality. That's what makes it all work. So, the 13th, 14th, 15th Amendments cement this vision after Lincoln's assassination. The 19th Amendment, it follows the same expansive view. All men and women are created equal. That's the way this works out in the progression of where our Constitution has gone. National freedom, universal freedom, is our national aspiration and ideal. Freedom is American. Everybody says, I don't think most people say, well, what's so great about America? It's freedom. Okay, well, this is what it is. This is the freedom we're talking about. It's not the freedom to go to Walmart. Okay? This is the freedom we're talking about. 1942, war poster. To exclude one group is the foundation of totalitarianism. Look, this world cannot exist half slave and half free, fight for freedom. Okay, this is a World War II poster talking about the totalitarian governments as a denial, a foundational denial of universal freedom. This is how much this is incorporated in the American psyche as it should be. This is freedom. So, freedom and the struggle against slavery and sexism. The movie Lincoln, by the way, really brings these themes out. Seneca Falls Convention, 1848. The Declaration of Sentiments. Now, there was a big debate they were having is, should we push for women to have the right to vote? I mean, look, we're so far behind on everything else. Do we really push for this right now? And there was a resolution, resolved that it is the duty of the women of this country to secure for themselves the sacred right to the elective franchise. People argued against this. Well-meaning people argued against this. Frederick Douglass was there, recently escaped from slavery himself, and he spoke eloquently in favor. I cannot accept the right to vote as a black man if women cannot also claim that right. The world would be a better place if women were involved in the political sphere. Okay, go ahead and clap for that a little bit if you like. I'll take credit for presenting you Frederick Douglass, but it was his words. In this denial of the right to participate in government, not merely the degradation of women and the perpetuation of a great injustice happens, but the maiming and repudiation of one half of the moral and intellectual power of the government of the world. Pretty forceful stuff. You know, you could think, oh, gee, he just got out of slavery himself. He doesn't have the right to vote himself. Maybe he just want to concentrate himself on getting black people the right to vote, black men. No. He understood the expansive vision that needs to happen for this democracy to work. 13th Amendment ended legal slavery. Its fathers, Thaddeus Stevens, Lyman Trumbull, James Ashley, Henry Wilson, Charles Sumner, Abraham Lincoln, all can be arguably the father of the 13th Amendment. 13th Amendment, though, had mothers. And the mothers were none other than Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton. See, they organized a petition drive that was the biggest that had ever happened to that point. The 13th Amendment passed as much because of them. Women's prominent role in abolition, and then they didn't stop. So you wouldn't have had the 13th Amendment without these women. And once they got a taste of what they could do, there was just no stopping them. At that point, everybody else was toast, okay? They were on a roll, and it didn't matter if it took them decades, they were going to get women the right to vote. They saw the commonality of the struggle against slavery and sexism. All must be we the people, or no one is. Okay, so the 13th Amendment's mothers. Their Women's National Loyal League coordinated the campaign on the 13th Amendment, largest petition drive. Nearly 400,000 signatures went to Congress for the passing of the 13th Amendment. Now, 400,000, we say today, big deal, 400,000. 400,000 back then in 1865 was a big deal. It's not like you could just go on the internet and sign up, right? They had to organize this stuff. Anthony and Stanton later took the struggle to fight for the 19th Amendment. Louisa May Alcott, Civil War, she was a Civil War nurse, involved in the women's suffrage movement, first woman to register to vote in Concord, Massachusetts. In Little Women, the father's away as a sergeant in the Union Army fighting against slavery. These books were a great success. She died a very wealthy woman. She made a huge amount on Little Women, Little Men, etc. in the sequels, right? Okay. Frankly, whenever I think of Joe, it's the 1933 version with Katharine Hepburn. It just kind of pops in my mind. Okay, and I'm going to misspell Joe. It's supposed to be Joe, J-O, I was just told. Okay, fine. I find it poor logic to say that because women are good, women should vote. Well, women shouldn't get the vote just because they're good, because they're not. They're no better than the rest of us, okay? But men do not vote because they are good. They vote because they are male. And women should vote not because we are angels and men are animals, but because we are human beings and citizens of this country. Okay, now this is during the Civil War. Okay, this shows what's going on, this connection between the ideas of ending slavery and also ending sexual slavery and the role of women who don't have the franchise. So, 19th Amendment gets passed, and of course there are legal challenges as soon as it gets passed. The first one comes from Maryland. 1920, August 26, 1920. 2 months later, Judge Oscar Lesser wanted to stop 2 women from registering in Maryland. The case is Lesser versus Garnett, 1922 case. States' rights argument. What he was arguing is that the Maryland Constitution limited the suffrage to men, that Maryland had not ratified the 19th Amendment, therefore, it could not be applied to them. Okay. The 19th Amendment destroyed state autonomy by increasing Maryland's electorate without state consent. Okay. Now, I kind of thought increasing the electorate was a good thing, but it's doing it without consent. This is his argument. Okay. This gets into the issue of states' rights. And this part of the talk is called States' Rights Ain't Right. States' rights limits we the people. Because we the people is a national concept. Remember, we will have republican governments for all states imposed by the national constitution. States' rights, kind of it's an idea that states have rights over the federal government, claims of 10th Amendment legitimacy. We're going to talk about that. This has been in our recent memory. George Wallace, okay, during his inauguration as governor. Remember he says, segregation now, segregation tomorrow, segregation forever. I really don't try to do the southern thing here, but okay. Segregation now, okay. He lives, I should have said states' rights now, states' rights tomorrow, states' rights forever. Look, one is just a stalking horse for the other. That's what states' rights ever has been and always will be. Argued yet today, Ted Nugent, the fine constitutional scholar he is, because our legislative, judicial, and executive branches of government hold the 10th Amendment in contempt, I'm beginning to wonder if it would have been best had the South won the Civil War. Okay, let's get one thing straight. The Civil War was a rebellion against the United States, and the people who fought for the Confederacy were traitors. Fine. But let's go from there. This is a symbol of courage and honor in fighting for states' rights and rebellion against federal overreach. Okay, historically speaking, that is 100% wrong. It's wrong on its own terms, and it's wrong historically. The reality is the South opposed states' rights before the Civil War. South didn't want states' rights at all, and there's a specific reason. The Fugitive Slave Clause of the Constitution was followed by the Fugitive Slave Acts of 1793 and 1850. It used all the mechanisms of the federal government to perpetuate and preserve slavery. See, the federal government was obligated under the Fugitive Slave Clause to return all escaped slaves. So you made it across the border from Maryland to wherever, was it Pennsylvania? The federal government would chase after you and send you back. See, if you didn't have that federal mechanism, the South could never have afforded to maintain the institution of slavery. And all a slave would have to do was flee north, and they'd be safe. And states in the deep South would flee to the border states, and then on it would go. That's why the Underground Railroad most of the time terminated in Canada. A much harder proposition. So you have this entire federal mechanism devoted to perpetuating slavery. Now what happens here? Several states in response passed personal liberty laws to protect their black citizens from getting kidnapped. They passed these laws. These went through great constitutional debate. The South viewed these personal liberty laws as a violation of the Constitution, the national government. South Carolina Senator John C. Calhoun, who laid the intellectual foundation for the Confederacy and the perpetuation of slavery, arguing that it wasn't just a necessary evil, but a moral good for black people and white people, okay? The new personal liberty laws rendered slave property utterly insecure. They are a flagrant violation of the spirit of the U.S. Constitution. He's not arguing for states' rights. He's arguing against states' rights. In this case, the northern states. Prigg versus Pennsylvania, 1842, asserted that the personal liberty laws were unconstitutional under the national constitution. Edelman versus Booth upheld a state conviction for helping a slave under the national constitution. This is the Taney court that later decides Dred Scott. They're basing this and Dred Scott on the idea of a national constitution and its protection of southern slave states' rights. Southern slave power blocked states' rights for northern states. So historically, they didn't care about states' rights in the least until it became convenient to do so to perpetuate the myth of the Civil War. Now, interestingly, this is a picture of the federal marshals enforcing the 1850 Slave Act. The interesting irony of history is that it was the expanded use of federal power, federal marshals, for instance, to enforce the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 that set the mechanism in place for later using that same federal power and federal marshals to enforce civil rights. This is the painting where you have federal marshals escorting this little girl to school. And it was that mechanism that the slave power created in the national government that was later used to unravel that and the vices of the Jim Crow South. States' rights justify barring the doors to segregate. This is again as George Wallace. Remember in Forrest Gump, they stick Tom Hanks in this little scene, if you remember that? Okay, fine. Hubert Humphrey, 1948, told the Southern delegates to get out of the shadow of states' rights and walk forthrightly into the sunshine of human rights. You understand this idea of the Southern strategy of Richard Nixon, the Republican Party. Once the Democratic Party starts taking these positions, the South starts to move away from, well, the Democratic Party, and frankly, it's the Republican Party's great tradition that passed the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. Okay, let's go to the 10th Amendment. Remember, the 10th Amendment, states have rights too. That is wrong. States do not have rights any more than that the federal government has rights. States have power. States have sovereignty. Now, sometimes that power and sovereignty is greater than the federal government has, okay? If I was to shoot one of you, I would be charged in state court, not federal court, unless it was on an Indian reservation or something like that, okay? So states have incredible sovereignty in our federalist system of government. That is true, but those are powers, not rights. Only individuals have rights, not states. We the people. It's based on a concept of individual rights. I heard some grumbling here about corporations. That's another problem. We'll talk about that in a different class, okay? I can only do one talk at a time, okay? Again, only individuals have rights. Okay, now what about this 10th and 9th Amendments? Okay, well, let's read the 9th Amendment. The enumeration in the Constitution of certain rights shall be not be construed to deny or disparage others retained by the people. That's the 9th Amendment. 10th Amendment. Remember Ted Nugent talked to us, the 10th Amendment? Well, here's what it says. The powers not delegated to the United States by the Constitution nor prohibited to the states are reserved to the states respectively or to the people. That's the 10th Amendment. So what do you have here? Rights are retained by the people in the 9th Amendment. Powers are reserved to the states or to the people. What the 9th and 10th Amendments really do is advance a radical idea. And that radical idea is rights are universal. Individual rights are universal. States don't have rights, only people have rights. Remember? Powers is what the 10th Amendment talks about. The 9th Amendment tells us individual rights are reserved to the people, the individuals. Okay? Sorry, Ted, you're wrong. See, not only are you historically wrong, when you sit there and whine about the 10th Amendment not being held in contempt, you haven't read the 10th Amendment because it doesn't say anything about states' rights. It says powers are reserved to the states. Great, I'll grant you that. But rights are retained by the people according to the 9th Amendment. That's the only way you can read these two amendments as being part of the same document. What happened in Lesser versus Garner? The Supreme Court unanimously held the 19th Amendment. The great Justice Louis Brandeis writes, the ratification is a federal function from Constitution Article 5, not subject to state limitation. The 19th Amendment was worded like the 15th Amendment, which has expanded state electorates without regard to race for over 50 years, despite Maryland rejected it. See, Maryland also rejected the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. Okay? Too bad. The Constitution says when you reach the certain required number of states, it's an amendment to the Constitution, and it applies to you too. We, the people, that means including all of us. This is much broader than what the framers could achieve in their lifetime. The right to be the people, we the people, used to mean white males. The universal view of the people is the modern challenge. The ultimate purpose of all this is something the framers knew. Hugo Black, loyalty comes from love of good government, not fear of a bad one. See, this broadening the franchise and the acceptance of the ideal of America is why America is strong. Okay, I'll go ahead and say it. That's what makes America great again. That's what does it. The framers knew that the Constitution of America had to grow into herself. Okay? They just had to do what they could do at the time. But this is why the document is so important and why those clauses in the Constitution protecting slavery couldn't stand forever and are nullified by us. So fighting for the right to be the people. The 19th Amendment is an indispensable part of this growth. 13th, 14th, 15th, 19th Amendment, right? The same as the other amendments from the Civil War. fighting for the right to be the people. The Declaration of Independence pronounced no new rights. See, rights were self-evident. It didn't say a bunch of new rights. No, you get them inherently because they're self-evident. The suffrage and civil rights movements was not about creating new rights. It was about getting rights recognized. That's what the whole struggle is, the recognition of rights, not the creation of new ones. America remains a vision of freedom for all people exercising that freedom in a democratic republic. So that's what it means to be American. And by the way, the people were there all along. It's one of my favorites. Friedrich Wilhelm Augustin Ludolf Gerhard von Steuben, okay? Von Steuben, it's sometimes pronounced von Steuben or von Steuben, okay. This guy was a very colorful history, to say the least. He wrote the Continental Drill Manual. He's the one he couldn't speak English. He used to tell somebody, come here and swear for me. Okay, what he did at Valley Forge, see, Washington got all these gentlemen adventurers, these aristocrats coming, wanted to join his army and get a commission and get some pay. Most of them were worthless. There were a few who weren't. One of them was von Steuben. Okay. Now, he taught the Continental Army how to fight and stand with regular soldiers in Valley Forge. He has a stamp. That's how important this guy is, okay? Ferris Bueller's Day Off, remember the parade that he crashes? That's the von Steuben Day Parade in Chicago, okay? If you make it in Ferris Bueller's Day Off, you know this guy is important, okay? This man was gay. He had to leave Prussia because he was charged with homosexual activity with young officers. Okay, so he flees Prussia, comes to America. This is in front of the White House. It's the Lafayette Monument. This is the panel devoted to von Steuben. Okay, now I don't know if the guy who did this sculptor, that's kind of this neoclassical style, but you kind of think the guy who did this was hip to von Steuben's real past, okay? And this is out there in plain view, okay? And so this man was clearly gay. And yet, America would not have become America without him. He was crucial to the Continental Army winning the fight. Okay? Crispus Attucks was the man who was killed in the Boston Massacre. He was a black man, probably a black Native American mix. Okay, so the first patriot in the American cause is a black man. James 14. Served honorably during the American Revolution, opened a shipyard, employed dozens of black and white people in the shipyard, died an incredibly wealthy man. Peter Salem shoots Major Picard at Bunker Hill. So a black man was crucial to what happened at Bunker Hill. James Robeson, one of more than 5,000 black people who fought in the Revolutionary War and several thousand who fought in the War of 1812. Only now starting to get recognized. There's very few records, but they were there. People were there all along. Molly Pitcher, she was a nickname. There's a story that her husband either was shot or fainted from the heat. She drops her bucket giving water to the troops and starts loading the cannon. Now, she may have actually been a composite for several women who were wives, girlfriends, concubines, prostitutes, all put into Molly Pitcher, okay? But the point is, women were fighting there all along. Betsy Ross made the symbol of we the people. This is American mythology. Frankly, if you go back to it, a lot of these stories were created by families like decades and centuries after, about the Betsy Ross making the flag thing. I think the only documentation is she changed the nature of the star, but not really the flag. But who cares? She was there, all right? It's part of the American mythology. Women were there fighting all along. Cokie Roberts, in her book Founding Mothers, chronicles a lot of this. But as with the old debate, republic or aristocracy, there remains the argument today of what constitutes we the people. Illegals have no rights, okay? Well, I'm sorry, I don't care, this isn't a debate on the boundaries of immigration law and what it should and shouldn't be, but if you're going with the premise that illegals have no rights, you just don't understand America. Rights are inalienable to the person. You don't have to be a citizen to have rights. There remains yet today two Americas. One is dedicated to the proposition all people are created equal, and it's an expansive view. America is a big country of universal rights with an inclusive constitution. And yet there remains a limited America view. Citizens and boundaries are strict. Some people are inferior. All through our history, we have had this struggle. Return to sender. We serve whites only, no Spaniard, Spanish, or Mexican. Closed borders now, illegal immigrants. Irish need not apply. No black people, no Jews, or no dogs. Christians only, Jews not. Chinese must go. This runs right through American history. These people just don't get it. The irony of American history is that America's creed's most devoted adherents are those historically denied its promises. By the way, I'll send a personal note. I have met this man, and he's signed 3 of those constitutions for me for my sons. Okay? Yeah. Okay. Black Americans did not abandon liberal democracy because of slavery, Jim Crow, or the systematic destruction of whatever wealth they managed to accumulate. Rather, they enlisted. They took up arms in 2 world wars to protect the vision. Japanese Americans did not reject liberal democracy because of internment or the racist humiliation of alien exclusion. The 442nd Infantry Regiment, go for broke, the Purple Heart Battalion. This was the highest decorated unit in the Second World War. 3,000 soldiers saw action. A 93% official casualty rate. It was actually probably close to 314% casualty rate. Now, how could that be? It was happening because guys would get wounded and hobble back to their units to fight more and get wounded again. So the casualty rate was above 100%, 314%. 21 Medals of Honor, 9,486 Purple Hearts, many with family back in internment camps in the United States. Women did not abandon the vision of we the people. Instead, they fought for it. And by the way, if you look at the campaign for the 19th Amendment, it was really clever. There was a lot of kind of violent response to it, and they always responded with things like votes for the women. For the work of the day, for the taxes we pay, for the laws we obey, we want something to say. League of Women Voters, register now. Give mom the vote. Shamelessly playing on the concepts of motherhood for a political end. You could find that appalling, but it worked. They didn't give it up until the 19th Amendment helped America grow into herself. The 19th Amendment keeps the promise. I like to think of myself as a good writer, but whenever I can steal something better, I'll do it right away. That this nation under God shall have a new birth of freedom. It's that continual renewal and engagement in that struggle that makes America great again. Oh yes, I'm running for county attorney in case anybody didn't know about that. Are there any questions? I've got a couple announcements, but we'll start with questions. Yeah?
No. Questions?
You mentioned let's make America great again a few times. And you know, I was watching some old World War II movies, and I don't know how much this is known, but you know what the Mussolini's slogan was?
No. Make Italy great again?
Let's make Italy great again.
Wow. Of course, he wanted to go back to the Roman Empire, but fine. Well, okay. Question?
Quick announcement. The first week of February, the McWhirter is presenting a new play, When Abraham Lincoln Met Frederick Douglass.
Oh, that's great. The Herberg is presenting a play, When Abraham Lincoln Met Frederick Douglass. There were several meetings at his second inaugural party. Frederick Douglass walks in the room in this big hall where a bunch of people were, and Abraham Lincoln stopped everything and said, "Oh, there's my friend Frederick Douglass," and walked across the room and shook his hand, which was, for the time, just shocking. You can say what you want about Abraham Lincoln and some of his statements, usually taken out of context about slavery and black people and different positions he held. Frederick Douglass said about him was he was one of the few white person that ever talked to him directly and regarded him directly as a person, and that there was a kind of a personal connection, which I think tells you a lot about Abraham Lincoln. So in writing, because right now I'm writing the history of the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment book, which is the next progression. And Abraham Lincoln is all over this in terms of the vision and what he provided. So,
Right.
yeah.
I'm having a tough time squaring away we the people with all men are created equal, and why they didn't use people instead of men, and how you went from pronoun to men when it's not a pronoun. So I really want to hear more about that because I'm not buying it.
Okay. Look, they were captured by their own culture, the framers. They had these aspirations, and the point of this talk is they had the aspirations, and they intended us to be better than they were. So we can grow. And by the way, we've done great. We live in a much better nation than they did by far, but we still have a lot of room to grow, I think. And so, yeah, they use the term we the people. They would have been better saying we the people of the United States, okay? But they didn't. And Thomas and Jefferson and went that. And all I'm saying is, grammatically speaking, you had an argument even back then that women were included. But they failed. I mean, see, I love the framers of the Constitution and their vision and scope for America, et cetera, but they were failures in that very thing, among other things. That's why it helps to talk about Gouverneur Morris losing his leg in a carriage accident when he was escaping from flagrante, okay? These were very flawed human beings. But they had a vision, and that vision's what's important. Does that somewhat cover?
I agree with you there.
Okay. Anybody else?
Hi.
When you talk about the,
Yeah. Go back. I'll get you. Somebody?
Okay.
Yeah.
The phrase "Make America Great Again," I was thinking maybe an improvement on that would be "Make America Better."
The phrase.
Yeah.
I'm only using the material that the culture and the politics gives me right now.
No, this is not a critique. I'm just a
Yeah.
view. It just. Well, anyway.
Look, put it. Make America great again. Well, you know what? We're better than America was in 1960. We're better than America was in 1950. We're just better. And we're better because we've advanced the ball a little bit. So this idea of make America great again on its own terms is bad. It's a failure to recognize why America is great. So, but I'm trying to be despite my shameless advancement of my own candidacy, I'm trying to be a little bit limited in political statement right here. But I could go there if you like. I'm perfectly happy.
No, we're good.
We're good. I think I've already pushed the boundaries on that a little much today.
Thank you.
Yeah, Susan.
Hi. Because I'm a writer and a member of the Writers Guild of America, they sent me a whole bunch of DVDs this year so that I could vote for my favorite as written. Two that I would recommend. One is Harriet,
Yes.
which is about Harriet Tubman and the Underground Railroad, which you mentioned. It's an excellent film. The other is Little Women, which you also made reference to. I happen to like, however you say her, Cherche, whatever her last name is. It's pronounced Cherche, the Irish lady who plays Louisa May Alcott. You like Katharine Hepburn. It's been made like 4 or 5 times.
Yes.
So I would also recommend that because it definitely shows strong womanhood. My other comment is you showed a book early on written by a female whose name I don't remember, but I noticed on the title page it had a period and her last name. In those days, if you were a woman writer, you did not use your full name.
Right.
And I would just point that out.
Or George Eliot, for instance.
Right, or
Yeah.
you could take on a male name, and it was very difficult. Louisa May Alcott was one of the forerunners in getting her full, not just Louisa Alcott, but Louisa May Alcott, and getting her full name out there. And she was a heroine to quite a few people. So I just wanted to make those comments.
Great. We have a question here.
Thank you. Please wait for the microphone. Hold on just
Hey,
a
he's doing the
second.
Phil Donahue thing.
Could you talk a little bit about the Supreme Court and strict constructionists and where we stand? Because this whole talk makes the Constitution a living, changing document.
Okay, can I talk about strict, okay, first of all, I have an entire talk on that one that I could give you about what originalism means, strict constructionism means. What they really mean are just political places where people like to hang their hats, okay? I argue that my reading of this, I have a little problem with the idea of a living constitution because it starts to make you unmoored from anything. Foundationally, we are what the framers originally intended because they recognize their own limitations. So I argue what I'm talking about, the way the Constitution is now with this universality of rights concept, that is the original intent. Because if you looked at the original intent of some of the people, is women would never have the right to vote. Okay, but they agreed to a greater, broader, expansive vision. Okay, strict constructionalism was more common in the 1960s and 70s, especially when Nixon was appointing people to the Supreme Court. The first strict constructionalists would be like Harry Blackmun and Hugo Black. Actually, I should say Hugo Black was the real first one. And he advocated, look, start with the words of the Constitution before you spin out in other directions. That's not a problem. It then became used as a argument against kind of, let's say, more progressive readings of the Constitution. And I think an inappropriate argument. For instance, a great originalist constitutional opinion is Miranda versus Arizona, which goes back to the original intent of the meanings to justify where the case goes. But that gets criticized as not being strict constructionist. So the new term for strict constructionist is something like an originalist, but there's all kinds of deviations of this. And you have to remember that academic careers are made arguing about the minutiae of all these terminologies with marginal benefit to what is really going on in the court or where things should be. So that's in the short version. Now, if you want the whole hour-long talk, I could call it up here and we could have a whole nother PowerPoint, right? But I don't think they plan for lunch, so that's the problem. Yeah.
I believe it was 2011 when the 442nd Regimental Combat Team won the Congressional Gold Medal.
Yeah, I noticed you there shaking your head when I went over the 442nd, yeah.
It was given to them by President Obama, and the bill was initiated by Adam Schiff.
Oh,
and Senator Inouye was a member of the 442nd
That's right.
Regimental Combat Team and lost his arm in Italy during the war.
Yeah. And by the way, who else was? Mr. Miyagi in Karate Kid. I'm a cultural historian. See, Mr. Miyagi, man. Arnold from Happy Days. Oh, no kidding? Arnold from Happy Days? Oh, there you go.
Any other questions?
I'll take just a couple announcements, and I'll be glad to take more. I'm often on Arizona Horizon, often talking now about the constitutionality of impeachment, what's going on for this. And I will be at Changing Hands Bookstore in Phoenix. This is Phoenix, not the Tempe one, on February 5th, 2020, talking about the Constitution and Donald Trump, Part 12. Okay? If I was to back them all up together, I would easily have you there for a full day. I also say if this would have been the Obama administration, I'd have enough for a half-hour talk and nobody would show. These are well attended. I'm already on Part 12 of this thing. So, so put that on your calendar if you'd like to talk about. And I always say my intent is not to be political, but the 45th president gives us a unique opportunity to learn about the Constitution. And as a constitutional scholar, I am gratified that an entire generation is looking up the word emolument. So that's good. Any other questions?
Any other questions? Thank you very much.
Good, thank you.
It's our tradition to mug our speakers. I'm sure you have a bevy of these at home already. But there's a new one. Thank you very much, Robert, for the speak. Big round of applause for Robert.
Thank you, Robert. Just want to reiterate once again, HSGP, we do get involved in legislation and public policy, as when Tori came up and talked about the sex ed bill. That's important. It's also important to say we don't support or oppose any candidates for any office. I know it's easy for people to get carried away sometimes, but that is a conversation that we are going to push forward. If you're interested in having that conversation, come back on Thursday, January 30th at 6 p.m. here. We are co-hosting a candidate town hall with the ACLU of Arizona, where all of the candidates will be represented. They will get equal time, and that is the time to bring your partisan and political questions. And Rob will be back, and we look forward to seeing you again.
And I will be partisan and political.
Another announcement. If you've noticed, we have Mark Bork, a professional video producer. Can you raise your hand? He is helping us shoot a promotional video for HSGP, and I've been talking with several people about participating in that. If you have signed up, or if you want to be involved last minute, we are going to lunch at Blue Adobe, and we are coming back to the library to shoot this video from 1 to 4 p.m. today. So make sure don't miss it if you're planning to be involved. Thank you so much, and I think we are good. You are dismissed.